what I would like to do today is thank you all for coming. I understood that there was a group of folks that were interested in my life. And for the life of me, I don't know why, but since you were interested, and since all of us have a little ego, I thought I'd come down and visit with you. I was afraid I was going to be late because I'd stopped on the way to take a look at my winter barley. And was very pleased as I looked at it. We have winter barley that's about 6 inches tall up at my house, and it looks like a really good potential barley season for next year, and I'm excited about that. But I did take a little extra time to sort of look at that and gloat a bit because I had a visitor not long ago that looked at my barley crop and was complimentary to the point of saying that even the best barley in England was no better than mine. So I'm more proud of that probably than anything I have done for this Georgia experiment. But anyway, my pride aside. So as I arrived down here, I started thinking, well, what do I want to tell you about things? And here we are in early February of 1748, I think. Hard to believe that these years have passed so quickly. But I'm here to share with you a little bit of what has happened in my life. But I'd like to start a little bit about where I am at this point. We have had a real struggle trying to create a pleasurable home here on this island. But in the last few years, we have really succeeded in making our spot here. This last year, we had the very best of a beer crop that we have ever produced. My fields were very productive. And over the last 5 years, we have not only built a new home and not only built some homes for our indentured servants, but we've built barns. In fact, right now, we just finished the malt house. And we have the malt house on the farm, on the plantation, is 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, which is a significant building. And next to that is our brew house. And in the brew house, we have a 500-gallon copper kettle. So we have begun to produce a reasonably large quantity of beer. And what I have found out is that there's more money in beer than there was in other crops that I have tried to grow here on Jekyll Island. And one of the reasons for that is that the basic crop for it, the starter, if you wish, for it, is the barley crop. And barley can be grown either in the summer or the winter. And in this part of the world, we grow it in the winter. So in the winter, we don't have a great deal of high temperatures. We don't have a lot of evaporation, and we get a really quality crop of barley. Now, on the farm here, I have tried indigo. We certainly have grown a lot of corn or maize. We've raised cattle. We've done a lot of things, and over time, each of them have sort of fit the needs of this part of the colony of Georgia. So, what is my concern at this moment? Well, labor is a concern. I don't know how many of you are aware that when the trustees formed this Georgia experiment, that there were 3 things that were prohibited on this island. And one of them was strong drink. Not too bad. And another one, which is kind of amazing, no lawyers. Lawyers were prohibited here. And lastly, no slavery. Now, the idea was that if you were going to bring yeoman farmers here to Georgia to create a new colony, that they would get sort of lazy if they had people who they owned to do the work. And the idea here was to prohibit slavery in the Georgia experiment. So what we really did is we built this on indentured servants, people who signed up, and for their passage, they were allowed to have in most cases, 50 acres of land, and they were to prove up the 50 acres of land, and it would become theirs. And of course, the idea was if they worked hard and it became theirs, we would start to build a community. And of course, this is the community that eventually became the colony of Georgia that we now live in. Personally, I have had a really hard winter. My wife has probably saved me, bless Rebecca. We had a really good crop, as I told you last year. We produced a lot of product but I also lost several of my indentured servants. The scoundrels just up and stole my boat and took off. So my labor force was really quite reduced. And I pretty much worked myself to death. At least that's what my wife said. You know how wives are. And I did get sick. In fact, I really got down last year, and I wasn't sure that I was going to make my way to 1748, but I did. I still don't feel terribly good, but suddenly I'm called again to go to Savannah, because suddenly there is a real driving urge from our people in the colony to approve slavery, to allow us to bring in slaves. Competition with neighboring South Carolina is really tough because we cannot create as much product by ourselves as the people who can purchase people to help them produce that product. So the pressure right now on the trustees of this colony is to allow slavery. Personally, I have always been opposed to slavery, but I must admit, last winter, as I lay in bed, sick and nearly dying in my mind, and certainly in my wife's mind, I began to think maybe the only answer to saving us might be to include slavery within the colony. So I have been asked to venture, in fact, I'm going to head out tomorrow to Savannah, and we're going to talk about this issue and determine what we want to ask the trustees to do about slavery. So that's sort of where I am at this moment. But I think my goal is to talk about me. Where did I come from? What did I do? How did I get here? Well, everybody knows their own story. Someone asked me in the audience not long ago about telling my story, and I said, remember, I'm telling my own story, and we're always the hero of our own story. So you will probably, take everything with a grain of salt. But my life began in Hertfordshire, England. I was born to Thomas and Philippa in the year 1708. And I had an older brother named Thomas, and I had two sisters. Thomas passed away at infancy, which left me the only son. And not too long after that happened, my mother remarried. Well, when she remarried, of course, she moved to another family. And we moved with her, but you know how those things turn out. Stepchildren and families and all of that stuff. It wasn't very long that I was pretty much out on my own. And my father didn't have a great deal of wealth because he died very young. I was just a child when my father passed away. So I inherited some from him. Maybe the most important thing was his fowling gun, but he had a small estate, and we were, well, not the gentry in Hertfordshire, but we were certainly a respected family, and I was the undersheriff for Hertfordshire County in England. But, where was I going to go? I could not see a way to get any great wealth, and I married, Rebecca and I very quickly, somebody needs to tell us how these things happen. We very quickly had 2 young children. Interestingly enough, named Thomas and William, kinds of 3 generations of the same name. Can you imagine doing a genealogical chart on us? But anyway, we have children, and I need to have a future. And all of a sudden, I heard about Oglethorpe. And Oglethorpe was working on a project in the New World, in a place called Georgia, where they were going to encourage people to travel there, establish homes there, and to begin to prosper there. There was all kinds of excitement about that. And the majority of the people that they were recruiting were people they were offering 50 acres of land. If they would prove up the 50 acres of land within a 10-year period, they would get the land ownership. And, these are people that were out there, you get the idea they were debtors. No, but some of those people didn't have money. Some of those people owed money. But what were you going to do with them? So this opportunity came about, and a significant number of people decided they'd do it. Well, they weren't the only ones. There were some of the people like me. Now, I could be real cavalier about it, but the honest truth is I had a few dollars, and therefore I was able to acquire some indentured servants. And for every indentured servant that you could bring to this island, you could get 50 acres of land. So I had 10 indentured servants, and therefore I had a claim on 500 acres of land, and those 500 acres of land were on the north end of an island off of the Jekyll Sound, named for a philanthropist in England named Jekyll. Well, I wrapped my group and we headed to the dock. They were very happy to accept me because I had some resources and I was also bringing people with me. And we boarded a ship and we were going to head to Georgia. Well, you know how those things work. Everybody's been trying to travel somewhere where things were backed up. And in the case of traveling by sail, wind is a big deal. And the winds were just not very favorable, and we ended up stranded along the British coast for quite a while, unable to travel to Georgia. And of course, Oglethorpe was very upset about this whole process because he was wanting to get us over to Georgia in time to work up some land and raise some food so we could get through the season. But you can't change the wind. And then we also were waiting for an accompanying ship named the Hawk from the British Navy. I don't know how the British Empire ever grew as it did because the Hawk couldn't even find us here on the British coast. And when it did finally find us and begin to escort it, in 2 days it got lost and we ended up coming to Georgia by ourselves anyway. The guy that managed the Hawk was named Gaston, and he finally found us about the time we arrived in Georgia. But anyway, we were able to successfully transfer across the sea. But there were some problems before we got going. There happened to be a pair of brothers named Wesley, and they happened to be on the same ship that we were on, traveling to the Georgia colony because Charles Wesley was going to become the new secretary of the colony, and his brother was going to convert the Native Americans en masse. Well, they met and prayed 3 times a day, carried on. And also they were very judgmental. And one of my servants, and remember these indentured servants were both male and female, one of my indentured servants was accused by John Wesley of immoral behavior. And actually, he forced me to have her sent ashore, and we could not, I was down a servant. Now, in his great grace, he did offer to replace the servant, but it really bothered me. What was it his business to be the moral police for me? So one day, while they were having one heck of a big church service in the center of the ship, I went out and I did a jig on the top of the roof and carried on and sang. Well, I'll tell you, John Wesley was some upset with me, and I was upset with him. In fact, we never did get along very well again. But somehow we survived, and we eventually left England, and we traveled across the ocean together. And we sat at the table with the captain, Charles and John and myself and several other gentlemen, and we got along. But being upset with John Wesley hurt me later on, because he was rather critical along the way before he was sent packing back to England again. But we arrived about 2.5 months late from where we had hoped, and they docked us at Tybee Island. And the reason they put us at Tybee is that they didn't want us to get away. They had all these people that were, suddenly there looking for land, and Oglethorpe said, keep all these people here on the island. They can get off, they can wash their bodies, they can wash their clothes, but heaven help anybody that has strong drink. And of all things, who did they put in charge of not having any drink? Wesley and me. Talk about opposite poles, but we were able to keep most people dry. The sailors, however, did find some rum, and they broke open a bottle and a cask, and we had to take it from them, and I'm surprised they took it rather well, and they didn't get upset with us as we broke their bottles and broke their cask. But we were there on Tybee Island waiting for transport to what would become Frederica. Well, it was an interesting thing happened is that the ships that we were on, they didn't know how to navigate these shallow waters, and they didn't want to come aboard without somebody down here without somebody knowing where they were going. So it was really another one of those places where we couldn't get things done. And then along comes a cargo ship full of cargo, and Oglethorpe goes over and he negotiates. He says, look, if I buy the whole bloody thing, will you take these people down to Frederica? And the guy thought, well, geez, I can sell the whole load, do it all at once? Yeah, I'll do that. So all of the men and all of the guns and all of the tools accompanied all of the equipment as it made its way down the coast to St. Simon's Island and to what became Frederica. Well, Oglethorpe immediately, for some reason, decided that he would choose me to be responsible for creating Frederica. Go on down there, guy, and build us a town. And that's what we did. We went down to Frederica. We set up a battery. We set up a large house for armament and all. And we began to lay roads out. We started a palisade around it. And the Native Americans came and helped us build houses. The houses were all thatched. They were all made out of palmetto leaves. They all sort of looked like little huts, but they were amazingly dry on a rainy day. The Indians definitely knew how to do that. So Frederica, when Oglethorpe came a couple of months later, the roads were laid out. The people's houses were all in place. The garrison was there. Not the garrison, but the cannons on the river. And he was amazed. Well, now, certainly I didn't get all that done, but I got credit for it. And that was my first promotion. I then became an ensign. I got my first promotion into the ranks of the British Army for my efforts there. Well, whatever he saw in me, he decided, you're the one. We're going down to see where the Spanish are. Now that's just kind of like, all right, here's a stick and go poke the hornet's nest. Because remember, the major reason of this whole thing politically working, always politics in it. The political thing that worked was that there had to be a buffer between the South Carolina colony and the Spanish. And who were they going to throw into that buffer? All of us poor old folks that were coming over here in a relatively unprotected situation. We didn't have any soldiers here. The whole thing was going to be militia volunteer to keep the Spanish from taking over. And remember, there's a reasonably large fort in St. Augustine, and a lot of Spanish soldiers, and a whole lot more just a little bit over in Cuba. And what stood between us and them were the yeoman farmers that, when we would call for help, would grab their musket and assemble somewhere. So anyway, Oglethorpe wanted to check things out, so he took me and a contingent of Highland soldiers from up in Darien and some Native Americans, and we paddled down to the St. John River to sort of see the territory. Well, it was kind of tough, you know. I've spent 2 months building Fort Frederica, and I've yet to even see the land that I'm supposed to have. And then I'm riding by it, looking at it as we head south to the St. John. Well, Oglethorpe certainly, sometimes his political acumen was a little bit on the offside, I thought. He decided that he wanted to put boats, patrol boats, in the St. John River in what would be Spanish territory. Heck, they claimed this. You imagine what they thought about that. And allegedly it was to keep the Cree Indians who had some disagreements with the Spanish periodically, to keep the Cree Indians north of the St. John River. Well, of course, the whole idea of it was he wanted to see what the Spanish had down there and what we had to deal with. But nevertheless, we made that trip, and we dropped off the group of Highlanders at Fort William. At the very bottom of Cumberland Island, there was a small fort, and we left those folks there, and we came back. I finally got a chance to see my own island and get my indentured servants over there, and they began to do a little bit of work in the field and started to create the beginnings of my plantation. And I was really excited. I thought, boy, I can finally get to work. And then Oglethorpe comes by again. He says, look, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go to St. Augustine, to the fort, to the Castillo, and I want you to meet with the Spanish and take my letter of introduction to them. So sure enough, trump back down the coastline to St. Augustine, and I was traveling with a fellow soldier and also an indentured servant. And as we were on foot going that direction, the indentured servant just came down. He just collapsed. He couldn't go any further. I kind of thought to myself, boy, I would have hated to bring him to work on the farm. He couldn't even walk down there. But anyway, he was left there with the military fellow that was with me, and I just proceeded to go on to the city by myself. And sure enough, I get to the river, and there's the fort, and there's nobody. So I grabbed my musket, and I fired a shot in the air. Still nobody came. And I grabbed the musket again, and finally, a group came from the fort out to meet me. And they sent a group to help the injured man and my friend back to the castle. And so as we arrived there, initially, they treated us great. Oh, heck, they had a ball that night. We got to go to a dress ball. There was lots of partying. And we thought, man, we've done okay. Well, we were about 2 days there, and all of a sudden they threw us in jail, called us spies. And of course, that's what we were. I mean, the whole idea was to go down there and check the place out. Well, Oglethorpe heard that we had been imprisoned, and he got all bristled up, and he came down with a bunch of armed men. But before he committed anything, the Spanish decided that, okay, they'd let us go, and we could go back home. So we ran into Oglethorpe, and he says, hey, you've established rapport with these people, go back. Just what I wanted to do, go back. So we went back, and we organized a meeting. And in a couple months, we were going to have the Spanish come up here to meet with the English for what would be maybe the first international conference ever held in this part of the world. Kind of fun, huh? This is Jekyll Island, right? This little tiny island, and suddenly the two world powers are going to meet on this island to talk about the delineation of land in the southern part of North America. And of course, the trick was, Oglethorpe said, these folks can't come to Fort Frederica because we don't want them to know that there aren't any real soldiers over there and that it's not a particularly well-developed, protected fort. So where are we going to have this meeting? On Jekyll Island, right on my place. No housing, we didn't have anything built yet, but we had two great huge tents, and we set the tents up, and the Spanish came and the English came, and we sat down to talk. Well, of course, I already mentioned that the Creek Indians were somewhat, fractious about those Spanish anyway. And here they had the Spanish leadership right here on their territory. Well, they snuck in at night, and they almost kidnapped the Spanish contingent. But fortunately, we were able to talk the Native Americans out of doing that. And we saved the Spanish from whatever the Indians were going to do to them. And we went ahead and had the meeting. Well, of course, the whole point of the meeting is the Spanish were figuring out how soon it was before they were going to invade us. And we were thinking about how soon it was before we were going to invade them. Does this sound like a lot of international meetings? Yeah, it does. It kind of rings true. But anyway, the meeting lasted 3 days, and they went back to St. Augustine, and we retreated back to Federica. But that meeting was probably not very successful, but it was pretty impressive. We had it in 2 large tents. Oglethorpe had a large tent, and I had a large tent, and they had chemise insides. They were really fancy tents. And we had our meeting. Well, now the next step was, of course, as soon as this was all on the table, Oglethorpe knew that he desperately needed to get back to England and get a regiment of soldiers here, because inevitably we were going to have to fight the Spanish. So Oglethorpe takes off. What does the sucker do? Hey, William, you're in charge. I'm going to make you a lieutenant. And now you are responsible for Frederica. So off he goes. And here I have all of these people, many of which have barely got shelter and are scratching out a little bit of garden somewhere. And they're hungry. And they're looking at me to help them. We had some tough times. The only thing that saved me, and I think some of you might have heard of Hereford cattle. They have white faces and they're red. Herefordshire is where they come from. And people who live in Herefordshire, like me, we were cattle people. And one of the best places to raise cattle? On an island, because you don't have to build any fences. The cattle are there. In fact, all you do is fence the cattle out of your field instead of fencing the cattle in the field. And we began to pick up feral cattle, and we started to have a reasonable herd. One of the things that's nice about Jekyll is there's lots of grass savannas that the cattle could graze in. And I had 10 servants, so they were able to clear some land, and we were planting corn. And why do you plant corn? The agronomist in me has to come out. Well, if you are growing something like wheat, and it grows this tall, and you were going to cut it with a scythe, and you were doing it in a place where you had just cut off all the growth and you had all kinds of stems sticking up, how successful would the harvest be? But with corn, it grows up and the ear is up at waist high. So you don't mind having mess underneath because the grain is elevated. And the Indian maize was available because we had Native American friends. So we could grow the maize and we could also raise the cattle. And this is what we used to feed the people in Fort Frederica. They would probably not have survived as a colony. They probably would not have survived as humans if it hadn't been for the productivity of the north end of this island. And the fact that Horton had enough land cleared because he had enough people to clear it that allowed him to provide food to get them over the tough patch. Well, of course, what happened next is Oglethorpe arrived, and he arrived with a regiment of soldiers, and none too soon. And suddenly now there is a garrison in Fort Frederica, and the people felt better. I mean, up until this, the only thing that stood between them and 2,000 or 3,000 Spanish soldiers in St. Augustine was 50 miles, 60 miles, or whatever, 100 miles of distance, and a few people with muskets and fowling pieces that were going to turn that army away. And suddenly now there were regular troops here in Fort Frederica. Well, of course, Oglethorpe pulled another one of his things. He decided, well, you're going to get promoted. You're now going to become a captain. And now you're in charge of this regiment. I really love the man. Every time I turned around, he had something for me to do and kept me from my own place. It was maddening. But we survived, and we did it. Now, he was there, and he tapped me now, and this was good. Remember, I haven't seen my wife or my 2 children now in nearly 5 years.
Oh, my gosh.
And he wanted someone to go to England to talk about the colony. And he also wanted somebody to bring back another regiment of soldiers because he knew we were still greatly outnumbered. So instead of going back to England himself, he sent me. So it was wonderful in the fact that I got to see my children, hardly recognized them after 5 years, and I got to see my wife. And I also did the political stuff. I went around and visited everybody who was anybody and told them how wonderful the colony in Georgia was. Now, you realize the shape it was in when I left, but I was very optimistic about it. I had a real problem, however, because Thomas Stevens, who was the son of the present secretary of the colony here in Georgia, had gone over during those bad times, and all he was telling everybody is what a terrible mess everything was. So I had to not only refute his stuff, but try to convince people that things were much better. Well, I guess I was the better bull thrower than he was, because somewhere along the line, they began to accept what was going on. The other thing is the people on the island, they were already looking at the slavery issue, and they were also looking at the fact that the period of time that they had to prove up their land for it to be their own didn't seem to be long enough with all the obstacles that they had to do. And remember, so many times we would have these, oh, the Spanish are coming, and everybody would rush out of the field, and they go to Frederica, and they'd get their guns, and the Spanish aren't coming. And it took them out of the field, and things didn't get done, and there was just a lot of angst about this. Well, I didn't believe in the slavery thing, but I certainly did believe that we needed to have a longer period of time for these people to get settled. And I negotiated that while I was there. So when I came back, I was able to actually tell people that we were somewhat successful. There were some who still didn't like the idea that I hadn't pushed the slavery issue, but they were very happy that I had worked with them. And on top of that, I brought a small regiment of soldiers. And the next thing was the soldiers could bring their families. Now, of course, the whole idea of that is if you brought your family over there, you'd probably stay. But I didn't really care because that meant I could bring my wife and my children. So we all headed back to Jekyll in triumph. When we arrived, as soon as we got to Fort Federica, we already heard that the Spanish were coming. The expected battle was going to happen, and I had just arrived with a contingent of soldiers, and of course, what does Oglethorpe say? Go stop them. So we loaded everything up. I put the family in Fort Federica, and we headed north to St. Andrews, to Fort St. Andrews at the end of Cumberland Island, to blunt the attack of the Spanish. Well, there were two problems with that. First, we were greatly outnumbered, and two, the Spanish decided to heck with Cumberland Island. We're going to Federica. They just went by us, and we weren't able to stop them. And they headed off. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the Battle of Bloody Marsh.
Yes.
But the ships were unloaded at Gaston Bluff and St. Simons, and the little fort at the bottom of St. Simons was quickly overrun. And the Spanish began marching toward Fort Federica. Unfortunately for them, they kind of got lost in the marsh. And the British were able to launch a surprise attack. The numbers that the British reported killed were much inflated from the reality. That sounds very much like a military operation too. But it was enough to turn the Spanish army back. And we're talking about 1,400 soldiers against a force of maybe 600. So there was really a mismatch here. But as they started to retreat backward, I don't know how much of this I can claim, but I'm going to claim it because I did it. We arrived back. We had come all the way to the bottom of Cumberland Island. We had no forces to fight against. So we brought the contingent of soldiers from there, and we headed back, and we boldly sailed right across what then was called Jekyll Sound. I don't know how St. Simon got the sound name, but it was Jekyll Sound then. We sailed across Jekyll Sound in plain sight of all of the Spanish. And they thought we were reinforcements. Well, we were, but there weren't nearly as many of us as they thought. But they didn't know how many soldiers they were against, and now suddenly we were arriving at the moment that the General Montenegro was trying to make a decision on what to do. And then they looked off and they thought they saw the mass of British ships coming from the north. And the Spanish decided they would go home. Thank goodness. Well, that was good for everybody except me. Guess what? I had built a nice wooden house on Jekyll Island. We had built barns. We had homes for our indentured servants. We had started agricultural enterprise. We had all of our cattle, and the Spanish decided, let's fix him. They burned it to the ground. They killed the animals. They destroyed everything that we had built because we were totally unprotected here on the end of this island. So as the Spanish went back, they left me ashes. I just brought the wife and kids home. They hadn't even seen the house that was burned to the ground. And suddenly, we had to start over again. Well, then, of course, the next thing that happens is, all right, I can do it. I've got people. We're going to build a house. We're going to build it out of tabby this time so the bloody fools can't burn it down so easily. There's great big midlands of shells all around, and we got our lime and our shells and our sand, and we created what now is called Horton House. The wife came. She created an herb garden. We rebuilt the barns. We started to get the farm back in shape. But what did Oglethorpe do? I'm done. I'm going home to England. And then what did he do? You're a major now. You're in charge of the whole operation. So I was in charge of the operation. Oglethorpe never returned to Georgia. And I was left with the responsibility of the garrison in Federica to make sure that we had food enough to keep the soldiers alive. And of course, one of the things that we started to do was create beer. And the first thing that everyone starts to say is, oh gosh, you've got to keep all those soldiers happy, you're going to get them drinking beer. Realize that it was a whole lot safer to drink beer than it was to drink the water. And we probably saved hundreds of lives by having available beer as opposed to trying to drink shallow well water with heavy populations of people living in Frederica. But nevertheless, my responsibilities then had not diminished. They had only gotten greater. And I'm really beginning to get sort of back to where I started. Because by now, by about 1745, I have my farm back in shape. We're beginning to ease into the development of our brewery. The people in Frederica are suddenly doing better. They've had more opportunity to get their act together, if you wish. They've already started building permanent housing. This city is beginning to take shape within the fort's walls. And I've actually got some time with my family and with my plantation. Now, of course, you know how kids are. I had 2 boys. And one of the boys, Thomas, he is bright as a penny. He was the younger of the 2. And we actually sent him to South Carolina to a school, not a college, there weren't any colleges, so to speak, but it was a school that was run by a French professor. And he became very prominent. And he later created a plantation on the Ogeechee River. And he was actually one of the signers of the Constitution, the Georgia Constitution, when it was finally written. My other son was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and he didn't really want to stay on the farm. And by that time, he had decided that the farm was worn out and run down, and he went elsewhere. And that really brings me full circle to where I started. As I sit here in front of you for the next trip up to Savannah to try and deal with this issue of slavery. I don't know this, but I never returned. I died of the same illness that I had here, and I was buried in Christ Church Cemetery in Savannah. That's a very brief life of William Horton.